Dr. Rachel Stevens froze mid-incision, her surgical blade suspended above the gaping wound as the metallic scent hit her like a physical blow. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across what should have been routine tissue, but this wasn't routine at all. What they'd expected to be a simple cyst removal had become something that defied 30 years of medical experience. The blackened, putrid mass beneath Marcus Thompson's skin pulsed with an otherworldly stench that made seasoned nurses stumble backward. Nurse Patricia, a 20-year veteran, bolted from the operating room, her hand clamped over her mouth. The metal instruments clattered against the surgical tray as another nurse's hands trembled uncontrollably. Even the anesthesiologist, hidden behind his mask, visibly recoiled. Through the observation window, Eleanor Richardson pressed her weathered palm against the glass, remembering her son Daniel's final words 15 years ago. "It's eating me alive, Mama." "Get the infectious disease team down here now," Dr. Stevens commanded, though her voice betrayed the professional calm she desperately tried to maintain. How had 11 years of medical negligence created this living nightmare beneath one man's skin? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 11 years earlier, Marcus Thompson was the kind of young man who made small-town mothers point him out to their daughters at Sunday service. At 19, his broad shoulders filled out his Letterman jacket with the easy confidence of someone who'd never known real failure. The freckles across his nose told stories of summer baseball camps, and his calloused hands spoke of honest work alongside his grandmother Martha in her vegetable garden behind their modest 2-story house on Maple Street. Millbrook, Ohio, wasn't the kind of place that produced major league dreams, but Marcus carried them anyway. The town of 8,000 had seen better days since the steel mill closed in 2009, leaving behind empty storefronts and families scraping by on part-time work. Yet there was something stubborn about the place, a determination that showed in the way neighbors still brought casseroles during hard times and how the high school football stadium stayed packed every Friday night, despite having more empty seats each year. Marcus lived with his grandmother Martha after his mother's death from breast cancer 3 years prior. His father, Earl Thompson, had disappeared into a bottle shortly after the funeral, leaving behind only unpaid bills and the lingering smell of cheap whiskey in the garage. Martha, a retired elementary school teacher with silver hair that caught the light when she laughed, had stepped in without question. "Family doesn't abandon family," she'd say, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she helped Marcus with college applications at their kitchen table. The house held memories in every corner. His mother's Bible still lay open on the coffee table to Jeremiah 29:11, the verse about plans for hope and a future that she'd quoted during her worst chemotherapy days. Her photographs lined the mantelpiece. Marcus in his first baseball uniform. Family Christmas mornings when his father still smiled, his parents' wedding day when they looked young enough to believe in forever. Martha had raised Marcus with old-fashioned values. "Actions speak louder than words, honey," she'd remind him when he'd get frustrated with his part-time job at Henderson's hardware store. "Character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when nobody's looking." She'd lived through the Depression as a child, understood the value of hard work and humility in ways that modern teenagers couldn't fathom. Marcus believed in those principles. He opened doors for elderly customers, volunteered at the food bank without being asked, and spent his Saturdays helping Martha tend her prized tomato garden. His baseball coach called him coachable, the highest compliment in small-town sports. College scouts had started calling, mentioning partial scholarships and the possibility of something bigger than Millbrook could offer. The future stretched ahead like an open highway. Marine biology fascinated him, and he dreamed of studying ocean life along California's coast. Sometimes, lying in his childhood bedroom under glow-in-the-dark stars his mother had pasted there years ago, he'd imagine himself in a wetsuit, cataloging species that most people would never see. It seemed possible then, when 19 felt infinite, and his biggest worry was whether to accept Ohio State's offer or hold out for something better. The crack of the bat against leather had always been Marcus's favorite sound, but on that humid Tuesday afternoon in May 2013, it carried the weight of everything he'd worked toward. The regional championship against the Riverside Ravens would determine which team advanced to the state tournament, and college scouts dotted the bleachers like hawks, their clipboards and stopwatches glinting in the late spring sun. Marcus crouched in center field, his cleats digging into the freshly cut grass as the Ravens' cleanup hitter stepped into the box. The score was tied 3-3 in the bottom of the ninth, and tension hung over Millbrook High's diamond like the gathering storm clouds that threatened rain. Coach Williams had pulled Marcus aside before the inning, his weathered hand gripping the young man's shoulder. "This is your moment, son. Show them what Millbrook boys are made of." The pitch came fast and inside, but the batter connected with a sharp crack that sent the ball soaring toward the gap in right center field. Marcus's legs churned as he sprinted back, his eyes never leaving the white sphere arcing against the darkening sky. He could hear the crowd rising to their feet, could sense his teammates holding their breath. This was the play that would either send them to Columbus or send them home. At full sprint, Marcus launched himself into the air, his glove extended as far as his arm would reach. For a suspended moment, he felt weightless, like the dreams where he flew over the cornfields that surrounded Millbrook. The ball settled into his glove with a satisfying thud, but gravity pulled him down hard, his left shoulder slamming into the unforgiving earth with a sickening impact that sent shock waves through his entire body. The crowd erupted as Marcus rolled over, ball still secure in his glove, arm raised in triumph despite the fire spreading across his shoulder blade. His teammates mobbed him at home plate, their celebration drowning out the dull ache that pulsed with each heartbeat. "That's my boy!" Martha's voice carried over the chaos, her proud smile visible even from the stands as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. In the locker room afterward, as his teammates whooped and planned their celebration at Murphy's Diner, Marcus sat quietly on the wooden bench, gingerly moving his shoulder in small circles. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, throbbing pain that seemed to radiate from somewhere beneath his shoulder blade. When Coach Williams asked if he was okay, Marcus managed a smile and a nod. "Just a little sore, Coach. Nothing a hot shower won't fix." But the hot shower didn't fix it. Neither did the ice pack Martha insisted he use that evening as they sat on the front porch, sharing a celebratory piece of her famous apple pie. "Sometimes the body whispers before it screams, honey," she said, studying his face with the concerned eyes of someone who'd raised 2 generations of Thompson men. "Maybe we should have Dr. Henderson take a look." Marcus waved off her concern. He'd played through worse injuries before, a sprained ankle during sophomore year, bruised ribs from a collision at second base. Pain was part of the game, and real ball players didn't complain about every ache and soreness. Besides, he had more important things to worry about. The Ohio State scout had approached him after the game, business card in hand, talking about partial scholarships and the possibility of walking on to their program. A week later, while changing his shirt after his shift at Henderson's Hardware, Marcus noticed it. A small bump beneath the skin of his left shoulder, no bigger than a marble, slightly raised and tender to the touch. He probed it gently with his fingers, the way his mother used to check his forehead for fever when he was young. It felt firm, like a knot in a piece of wood, and it moved slightly under pressure. "Probably just pulled something," he muttered to his reflection in his bedroom mirror, the same mirror that had watched him practice his batting stance since he was 8 years old. The bump wasn't particularly painful unless he pressed on it directly, and it seemed insignificant compared to the college applications spread across his desk and the baseball season that was entering its most crucial phase. Dr. Henderson had been the Thompson family physician for over 30 years, delivering Marcus into the world and treating every childhood scrape and sniffle since. His office hadn't changed much in all that time. The same faded motivational posters on the walls, the same creaking examination table, the same gentle bedside manner that had comforted 3 generations of Millbrook families. "Just a sebaceous cyst, son," Dr. Henderson pronounced after a brief examination, his experienced hands probing the small lump with professional confidence. "Nothing to worry about. These things pop up sometimes, especially in young athletes. All that sweating and friction from equipment." He prescribed a topical antibiotic cream and suggested Marcus keep the area clean and dry. "Should clear up on its own in a few weeks. Come back if it gets bigger or starts bothering you." Marcus left the clinic feeling relieved, the prescription cream tucked in his jacket pocket like a promise that everything would return to normal. The bump didn't disappear. By the end of Marcus's senior year, it had grown from marble-sized to something closer to a ping-pong ball, a persistent reminder that Dr. Henderson's optimistic prognosis had been wrong. Marcus found himself unconsciously adjusting his posture to accommodate the growing mass, sleeping more on his right side to avoid the discomfort of lying directly on it. His batting average had dropped 15 points since the championship game, though he attributed it to senioritis rather than the nagging distraction beneath his shoulder blade. Sarah Martinez had been his girlfriend since junior year, a cheerleader with kind eyes and plans to study nursing at the community college. She'd noticed his subtle changes before anyone else. The way he flinched when she hugged him from behind, how he'd started wearing loose-fitting shirts even during the humid Ohio summers. "It's getting bigger, isn't it?" she asked one evening as they sat in his truck outside her house, her fingers tracing the outline of the growth through his t-shirt. Marcus pulled away instinctively, a defensive gesture that had become second nature. "Dr. Henderson says it's normal. Some people just get these things." But even as he said it, he could see the doubt in Sarah's dark eyes, the way she bit her lower lip when she was worried. The bump was no longer something he could ignore or hide beneath strategic clothing choices. It had developed an irregular shape, occasionally tender and warm to the touch, sometimes producing a clear discharge that stained his undershirts. The real turning point came during his senior baseball banquet, when Coach Williams announced that Marcus had been selected for the all-conference team. As he stood to accept his plaque, the fitted dress shirt he'd borrowed from his father's closet pulled tight across his shoulders, making the asymmetry impossible to miss. He caught Mrs. Patterson, the bank president's wife, whispering to her husband behind her program, their eyes fixed on his left shoulder with poorly concealed curiosity. That night, Marcus stood shirtless in his bathroom, studying his reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. The growth had taken on a life of its own, protruding nearly 2 inches from his shoulder blade and stretching the skin until it appeared translucent and angry. Red streaks radiated outward like spider webs, and when he pressed against it, a yellowish fluid seeped from what appeared to be a small opening at its peak. Martha found him there an hour later, tears streaming down his face as he gripped the bathroom sink. "Oh, sweet boy," she whispered, her weathered hands gentle on his bare shoulders as she examined the mass that had been stealing her grandson's confidence one day at a time. "We're going to see a specialist. I don't care what it costs." Dr. Peterson practiced in Cleveland, 40 miles northeast of Millbrook, in a gleaming medical complex that made Henderson's small-town clinic look like a relic from another era. His diplomas covered one wall of his office, impressive credentials from Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic that should have inspired confidence. After a thorough examination that included pressing and manipulating the growth until Marcus's eyes watered, Dr. Peterson delivered his verdict with the casual certainty of someone who'd seen it all before. "It's definitely a lipoma," he announced, settling behind his mahogany desk with Marcus's file spread before him. A benign fatty tumor, very common in young men your age, especially athletes. The good news is we can take care of this today if you'd like. Simple drainage procedure, local anesthetic. You'll be home in time for dinner. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him so powerful that his knees went weak. After months of growing anxiety, sleepless nights, and the constant awareness of the alien presence on his back, Dr. Peterson's confident diagnosis felt like a reprieve from a death sentence he'd been too afraid to name. You can really fix it. Today? The procedure itself was surprisingly quick and painless. Dr. Peterson numbed the area with several injections of lidocaine, then made a small incision at the apex of the growth. Marcus couldn't see what was happening, but he could hear the wet sounds of fluid being withdrawn, the satisfied murmurs of medical staff as syringe after syringe filled with yellowish liquid. "There we go," Dr. Peterson announced after 20 minutes. "Got about 8 ounces out of there. Should deflate nicely now." The relief was immediate and profound. For the first time in months, Marcus could lie flat on his back without discomfort. The grotesque bulge had reduced to merely a soft, deflated pouch of skin that Dr. Peterson assured him would tighten up over time. "Keep it clean and dry," the doctor instructed, prescribing antibiotics as a precaution. "Come back in 6 weeks for a follow-up, but I expect you'll be good as new." Marcus drove home with the windows down, singing along to the radio with a joy he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Martha cried when she saw him, her relief matching his own as she traced the flattened area with gentle fingertips. "My boy's going to be just fine," she whispered. And for the first time in months, Marcus believed it. He threw away all his loose-fitting shirts, bought new clothes that actually fit his frame, started sleeping on his stomach again. Sarah noticed the change immediately, commenting on how much happier he seemed, how the shadow that had been hanging over him for months had finally lifted. College seemed possible again. Baseball felt fun rather than stressful, and the future stretched ahead with renewed promise. 6 weeks later, Marcus was shampooing his hair when he felt it. A small, familiar firmness beneath the scar tissue where Dr. Peterson had made his incision. His heart stopped as his soapy fingers explored the area, finding not just one bump but several, clustered together like grapes beneath his skin. "No," he whispered to the shower walls, his voice echoing off the tiles. "No, no, no." By the time he toweled off, the truth was undeniable. Whatever Dr. Peterson had drained was coming back, and it was bringing friends. The return of the growth marked the beginning of Marcus's descent into a world he'd never imagined existed, a shadow realm where medical professionals shrugged their shoulders and employment opportunities evaporated like morning dew. Within 3 months, what Dr. Peterson had confidently drained had not only returned, but multiplied, creating a constellation of interconnected masses across his left shoulder blade that made his original problem seem quaint by comparison. The first job interview after the recurrence was at Miller's Auto Parts, a family-owned business where Marcus had hoped to work part-time while attending community college. He dressed carefully in a button-down shirt and tie, practiced his handshake with Martha, and arrived 10 minutes early with references in hand. The interview had gone well until Mr. Miller asked him to lift a box of brake pads to test his physical capabilities. As Marcus raised his arms, the shirt pulled tight across his back, revealing the unmistakable asymmetry of his condition. Mr. Miller's expression shifted from professional consideration to barely concealed discomfort. I'll call you," he stammered, suddenly eager to end the meeting. The call never came. Instead, Marcus learned through a friend that the position had been filled by someone with a more professional appearance. Code words that would haunt him through dozens of similar rejections over the coming months. The pattern repeated itself with soul-crushing regularity. Restaurants didn't want servers who might make customers uncomfortable. Retail stores worried about their image. Even manual labor jobs, where appearance shouldn't have mattered, found reasons to pass him over. One construction foreman was brutally honest. "Look, kid, the guys on my crew can be rough. They see something different, they're going to talk. I can't have that kind of distraction on a job site." By his 20th birthday, Marcus had developed an elaborate wardrobe designed to camouflage his condition. Oversized hoodies became his uniform, chosen specifically for their ability to blur his silhouette and hide the growing mass that now measured nearly 6 inches across. He discovered that certain colors, dark blues and blacks, were more forgiving than others, and he learned to layer clothing in ways that created the illusion of symmetry. The psychological toll proved even more devastating than the physical discomfort. Sarah, who had initially been supportive during his recovery from Dr. Peterson's procedure, grew increasingly distant as the growth returned and expanded. Their conversations became strained, filled with awkward silences and her obvious discomfort whenever he removed his shirt. The end came on a warm summer evening when she finally voiced what had been building for months. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," she said, her voice breaking as they sat in their usual spot overlooking Miller's Pond. "I've tried, I really have. But every time I look at you, all I can think about is that thing. It's not fair to either of us." Her tears felt like acid on his already wounded soul, and though he wanted to argue, to fight for their relationship, he found himself nodding in understanding. How could he ask her to love something he couldn't even look at in the mirror? The isolation that followed Sarah's departure was suffocating. Friends from high school had scattered to colleges and jobs in other cities, and Marcus found himself increasingly alone with his condition and the growing stack of medical bills that represented his futile search for answers. He'd seen 4 different doctors by then, each offering variations of the same unhelpful diagnosis. Benign growth, nothing to worry about, purely cosmetic concern. Doctor. Williams, a dermatologist in Columbus, had been particularly dismissive. "Young man, you need to understand that not every imperfection can or should be surgically corrected," he'd lectured, barely glancing at Marcus's back before scribbling notes in his file. "This is clearly a recurrent lipoma. They're unsightly, yes, but completely harmless. My advice would be to accept it and move on with your life." Accept it and move on. The words echoed in Marcus's head as he lay awake at night, the growth pressing against his mattress like a constant reminder of his abnormality. How do you accept something that makes children stare in grocery stores and mothers pull their kids closer when you pass? How do you move on when potential employers take one look at your silhouette and find reasons to hire someone else? Martha watched her grandson's transformation with the heartbreak that only a grandmother can understand. The confident young man who had once filled their house with laughter and baseball stories had become a ghost of himself, shuffling through days with his hood pulled up and his shoulders hunched in permanent defensive posture. She'd tried everything she could think of: home remedies passed down from her mother, prayer circles at church, even a consultation with a naturopathic healer who charged $50 to tell them the growth was caused by blocked energy. "You're disappearing right before my eyes, honey," Martha said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the abandoned steel mill. "Your body might be sick, but don't let it kill your spirit, too." Her arthritic hands were gentle on his arm, the same hands that had bandaged his childhood scrapes and taught him to tie his shoes. But even Martha's unwavering love couldn't heal what was breaking inside him. By 2019, Marcus had stopped looking in mirrors altogether. He'd developed elaborate routines to avoid his reflection, brushing his teeth with his back to the bathroom mirror, changing clothes in his darkened bedroom, avoiding store windows and car mirrors whenever possible. The sight of his own deformity had become too painful to bear, a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen from the promising young athlete he'd once been. The financial pressure was relentless. Martha's teacher's pension barely covered the household expenses, and Marcus's sporadic employment couldn't keep up with the mounting medical bills and the basic costs of living. He'd applied for disability benefits twice, only to be rejected both times with form letters explaining that his condition didn't meet the criteria for assistance. Not severely limiting, the bureaucratic language stated, as if the officials making these decisions had any idea what it felt like to be unemployable because of something growing on your back. The smell had started around his 22nd birthday, a faint sour odor that seemed to emanate from the growth itself, becoming more pronounced when he was stressed or had been active. No amount of showering or deodorant could mask it completely, and Marcus became hyper-aware of how people's expressions changed when they caught a whiff of the distinctive scent that had become part of his identity. Church became another casualty of his condition. The small Baptist congregation where Martha had worshipped for 40 years had been initially supportive, organizing prayer circles and offering words of encouragement. But as months turned to years and Marcus's appearance became more challenging to ignore, the invitations to church dinners stopped coming. People still smiled and nodded politely, but their eyes couldn't hide their discomfort. And Marcus found himself making excuses to stay home rather than subject himself to their well-meaning but painful sympathy. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in November 2020. Marcus had been waiting for a bus outside the unemployment office, his hood pulled up against the drizzle, when a mother with 2 young children sat down beside him on the bench. The younger child, a girl of maybe 4, stared at him with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "Mommy, what's wrong with that man?" she whispered, loud enough for Marcus to hear every word. "He smells funny, and his back is all bumpy." The mother's face flushed red as she tried to shush her daughter, but the damage was done. Marcus stood up abruptly, mumbling an apology as he walked away from the bus stop, choosing to walk the 3 miles home in the rain rather than subject himself to any more scrutiny. By the time he reached Martha's house, he was soaked to the skin and shivering, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of seeing himself through a child's unfiltered perception. That night, for the first time since the growth had appeared, Marcus allowed himself to truly examine what his life had become. He was 23 years old, unemployed, living with his grandmother, and carrying a medical condition that seemed to repel everyone who encountered it. The dreams of college and marine biology felt like they belonged to someone else, a different person who had died on that baseball field 7 years ago when he'd made the catch that started it all. Martha found him sitting at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, still in his damp clothes, staring at the stack of overdue bills and rejection letters that had become the documentation of his diminishing prospects. "I'm thinking about leaving," he said quietly, not looking up when she sat down beside him. "Maybe if I go somewhere nobody knows me, somewhere I can start fresh." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew there was no running from something that was literally attached to him. The growth had become more than a medical condition. It was his identity, his prison, and his constant companion in a journey toward isolation that seemed to have no destination except deeper into the darkness that had swallowed the life he'd once planned to live. The Cleveland winter of 2020 arrived with a vengeance that seemed personal, as if nature itself had decided to test Marcus's already depleted reserves of endurance. By December, Martha's condition had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer safely live alone. The dementia that had been creeping through her mind like fog finally claimed enough territory that the state intervened, placing her in Sunset Manor, a care facility 40 minutes outside Millbrook that smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Marcus stood in the empty house on Maple Street, surrounded by 70 years of accumulated memories and facing an impossible choice. The monthly rent on the modest two-bedroom home was $800, money he didn't have and couldn't earn with his condition making him unemployable. He'd sold everything of value months ago, his baseball trophies to a memorabilia collector, his mother's jewelry to a pawn shop, even his grandfather's tools to pay for one last medical consultation that had yielded nothing but another shrug and a prescription for topical antibiotics. The growth had continued its relentless expansion, now spanning his entire left shoulder blade and extending down his back like a grotesque mountain range beneath his skin. The smell had intensified too, a sickly sweet odor that reminded him of overripe fruit left too long in the sun. No amount of washing could eliminate it completely, and Marcus had learned to recognize the subtle shift in people's expressions when they caught the scent. The slight wrinkle of the nose, the unconscious step backward, the sudden need to check their phone or find somewhere else to be. His first night sleeping in his car outside the Walmart parking lot, Marcus told himself it was temporary. Just a few days until he figured something out. Maybe until the disability appeal he'd filed came through, or one of the dozens of job applications he'd submitted online yielded a response. The Honda Civic that had carried him through high school was 13 years old now, with a heater that worked sporadically and windows that no longer sealed properly against the Ohio cold. The Walmart security guard, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, found him on the third morning. "Can't stay here, son," he said gently, tapping on the frost-covered window. "Management's complaining. You understand." Marcus nodded and drove away. But where do you go when you have nowhere to go? He tried the parking lot at the defunct shopping mall, then a rest stop on Route 11, always moving before anyone could call the authorities or ask uncomfortable questions. Cleveland's homeless shelters were overcrowded and operated on a first-come, first-served basis that meant standing in line for hours with no guarantee of a bed. The first time Marcus attempted to use one, the intake coordinator took one look at his medical condition and suggested he might be more comfortable elsewhere. "We've got families with children here," she explained, her professional sympathy not quite masking her discomfort. "Maybe you should check with university hospitals, see if they have resources for people with your situation." University hospitals referred him to a clinic that referred him to social services that referred him back to the shelters, a bureaucratic circle that accomplished nothing except consuming gas money he couldn't afford to waste. Eventually, Marcus stopped trying to navigate the system designed to help people like him and started learning the informal rules of life without an address. The bus stops became his salvation and his torture. Cleveland's RTA shelters provided temporary respite from the wind and snow, but they also attracted the attention of other desperate souls and the occasional police officer checking on loiterers. Marcus learned to rotate between different stops, never staying at one location long enough to be noticed or remembered. He discovered which vending machines might still dispense a Coke if you knew exactly where to push, which fast food restaurants had unlocked restrooms, and which parking garages provided the best protection from the elements. The hunger was constant, a gnawing companion that never left his side. Marcus had always been thin, but by January he looked skeletal, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds since summer. He haunted the dollar menu at McDonald's, making a single small coffee last for hours while he used their Wi-Fi to search for jobs he knew he'd never get. The teenage employees recognized him after a while, their expressions cycling from pity to annoyance as he occupied a table meant for paying customers. One particularly brutal night in February, with temperatures dropping below zero and the wind coming off Lake Erie like a living thing determined to strip the warmth from everything in its path, Marcus found shelter in the doorway of a closed pawn shop. He'd wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned, 3 shirts, 2 hoodies, and a jacket that had seen better days. but still couldn't stop shivering. The growth on his back made it impossible to find a comfortable position, and the concrete steps seemed to leach heat from his body no matter how he positioned himself. That's when he saw her. A little girl with blonde pigtails poking out from under a bright pink winter hat, no more than 11 years old, walking toward him through the snow with the fearless confidence that only children possess. She wore mismatched mittens, one red, one blue, and carried a backpack covered in Disney princess stickers that seemed absurdly cheerful against the bleak urban landscape. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked, stopping directly in front of him without the wariness that adults had learned to show around homeless people. Her voice was clear and concerned, unmarked by the judgment that had poisoned every interaction Marcus had experienced in recent months. Behind her, an older woman approached more cautiously, her gray hair tucked beneath a wool scarf and her eyes sharp with the protective instincts of someone responsible for the child's safety. Marcus tried to speak but found his voice had abandoned him, frozen somewhere between his chattering teeth and his pride. He managed a weak nod, pulling his hood lower to hide the growth that he knew would end this moment of human connection the instant it was discovered. The little girl, Emma, he would later learn, studied him with the intense focus that children bring to puzzles they're determined to solve. "Grandma Eleanor, he's really cold," Emma announced, turning to the older woman with the matter-of-fact authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Can we help him?" Her grandmother moved closer, and Marcus could see her mental calculation, the assessment of danger, the weighing of compassion against caution, the decision that would determine whether he spent another night slowly freezing on concrete steps. Eleanor Richardson was 67 years old and had spent 40 years as a registered nurse before retiring to raise her granddaughter after her own daughter's death in a car accident 3 years prior. She'd seen enough human suffering to recognize the real thing, and something in Marcus's eyes, not the predatory desperation of addiction or mental illness, but the quiet defeat of someone who had simply run out of options, made her decision for her. "Emma's right," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of making life-and-death decisions in hospital corridors. "You need to get out of this cold before you freeze to death. Can you walk?" Marcus nodded again, not trusting his voice, but managing to struggle to his feet with movements made clumsy by cold and malnutrition. The 3-block walk to Eleanor's modest duplex on Euclid Avenue felt like a journey between worlds. With each step away from the doorway that had been his shelter, Marcus felt the surreal sensation of re-entering the realm of the living. Streetlights cast yellow pools of warmth on the sidewalk, house windows glowed with the promise of heat and safety, and the simple act of walking alongside other people reminded him of what it felt like to be human, rather than just an obstacle for others to navigate around. Eleanor's house was small but immaculate, the kind of home where everything had its place and years of habit had created routines that made chaos impossible. She guided Marcus to the living room sofa, a burgundy piece of furniture that had clearly seen decades of service but remained comfortable and welcoming. The warmth hit him like a physical force, and for a moment he feared he might cry from the sheer relief of being somewhere that didn't require constant vigilance against cold, danger, or the judgmental stares of strangers. "First things first," Eleanor announced, disappearing into the kitchen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. "You need food and something hot to drink. Emma, get the spare blankets from the hall closet." The little girl scampered away, her snow boots leaving wet tracks on the hardwood floor, while Marcus sat in stunned silence, afraid that any movement might break the spell and send him back to the frozen streets. The warmth of Eleanor's home became both Marcus's salvation and the stage for revelations that would shake the foundation of everything he thought he understood about his situation. For 3 weeks he lived in the small guest bedroom that smelled of lavender sachets and old quilts, slowly regaining his strength under Eleanor's watchful care. She fed him homemade soup and cornbread, never asking questions about his condition or his circumstances, treating him with the same matter-of-fact kindness she might show a stray cat that needed healing. It was Emma who finally broached the subject that everyone had been carefully avoiding. One evening, as Marcus helped her with her homework at the kitchen table, she looked up from her math problems with the direct curiosity that only children possess. "What's that thing on your back?" she asked, her pencil tapping against her notebook. "It makes your shirts fit funny. And sometimes I hear you crying at night." Marcus felt his face flush with shame, the familiar urge to flee rising in his chest like a trapped bird. But something in Emma's eyes, not disgust or fear, just honest curiosity, made him pause. It's sick," he said finally, the words feeling foreign after years of medical professionals dismissing his concerns. "The doctors don't know what it is, and it keeps getting bigger." Eleanor had been washing dishes at the sink, but she turned around at his words, drying her hands on a dish towel with deliberate care. "Mind if I take a look?" she asked, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who had spent decades examining human ailments. "I've been a nurse for 40 years. I've seen things that would curl your hair." With trembling hands, Marcus pulled off his hoodie and t-shirt, revealing the grotesque landscape that his back had become. The growth now covered most of his left shoulder blade and extended down toward his spine, an angry red mass that wept constantly and filled the air with that distinctive, sour smell. Eleanor moved closer, her trained eyes taking in details that other medical professionals had dismissed or ignored. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, her professional composure cracking for just a moment. But then her training kicked in, and she began a careful examination, her gentle fingers probing the edges of the mass while she murmured observations to herself. "How long has it been draining like this?" she asked. "And these red streaks, when did they start?" As Marcus answered her questions, Eleanor's expression grew increasingly grave. The red lines spreading outward from the growth weren't just cosmetic concerns. They were signs of systemic infection, of poison spreading through his body in ways that his previous doctors had either missed or chosen to ignore. "Son," she said quietly, "this isn't just a cyst or a lipoma. This is sepsis waiting to happen. Maybe it's already started." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Eleanor sat Marcus down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a confession that would reframe everything he thought he knew about his situation. "I need to tell you something," she began, her weathered hands wrapped around her mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth. "About why I brought you home, why I can't just let you go back out there." She walked to an old secretary desk in the corner of the living room and returned with a photograph. A young man with sandy hair and a shy smile, wearing a high school graduation cap and gown. "This is my son Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had something like what you have." Different location, but the same rejection from doctors, the same dismissal of his pain. The story came out in fragments, painful memories reassembled like pieces of broken glass. Daniel Richardson had developed a growth on his neck when he was 17, right before his senior year of high school. Like Marcus, he'd been told it was nothing serious, just a cosmetic issue that would resolve itself with time. Like Marcus, he'd watched his social life disappear as the growth became more prominent and began to smell. Like Marcus, he'd been rejected from job after job, relationship after relationship, until isolation became his only companion. He was 22 when he couldn't take it anymore, Eleanor continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I found his note on my kitchen table, right where you're sitting now. It said he couldn't live as a monster anymore, couldn't bear to see the disgust in people's eyes when they looked at him." She reached across the table and grasped Marcus's hand with surprising strength. "I failed my boy. I let the doctors convince me it wasn't serious. I let him suffer alone. But I won't make that mistake again." The weight of her confession settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket, but it wasn't the crushing burden he might have expected. Instead, it felt like validation, proof that his suffering was real, that his pain had been legitimate all along. Someone finally understood that this wasn't just about vanity or cosmetic concerns. This was about survival, about maintaining humanity in the face of a medical system that had abandoned him. The next morning brought a crisis that would test every bond they'd formed. Emma woke up screaming, doubled over with abdominal pain that sent Eleanor into the efficient panic mode of a medical professional recognizing a true emergency. As she called 911, Marcus helped carry Emma to the car, her small body burning with fever and her face twisted in agony that reminded him too vividly of his own silent suffering over the years. At Cleveland General Hospital, the diagnosis came quickly: acute appendicitis with signs of perforation. Emma needed emergency surgery immediately, but there was a problem. The hospital's surgical schedule was completely booked with only one emergency slot available in the next 12 hours. The surgeon, Dr. Patricia Wells, explained the situation with the clinical detachment that Marcus had learned to hate. "We can put her on the waiting list, but if another emergency comes in..." That's when Eleanor made a phone call that would change everything. Through her nursing connections, she'd learned about a social media campaign that had been building around Marcus's story, a viral post that someone had started after seeing him on the streets, complete with photographs and a plea for medical help. The post had been shared thousands of times, eventually reaching Dr. Rachel Stevens, a dermatologist and social media personality known for her work with unusual skin conditions. Dr. Stevens had been trying to reach Marcus through various channels, offering to examine his case pro bono if he could make it to her clinic in California. Eleanor had been planning to surprise him with the news, but now she found herself in an impossible position. She had the surgeon's attention and the promise of that one available surgical slot, but she could use it for either Emma or Marcus, not both. "Take him," she told Dr. Wells without hesitation, gesturing toward Marcus. "His condition is life-threatening too, and he's been waiting 11 years for someone to take him seriously." But Marcus was already shaking his head, backing away from the conversation with the same instinct that had kept him alive on the streets. "No," he said firmly, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Emma goes first. She's just a kid. She has her whole life ahead of her." He looked at Eleanor with eyes that had learned too much about sacrifice. "I've been dying slowly for 11 years. I can wait a little longer." The argument that followed was fierce but brief. Eleanor raged about wasted opportunities and Marcus's stubborn nobility, while he stood his ground with the quiet determination of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. Not his own survival, but the chance to save the little girl who had seen him as human when the rest of the world had written him off as a monster. In the end, Emma was wheeled into surgery while Marcus sat in the waiting room, his infected back throbbing with each heartbeat, wondering if he'd just thrown away his only chance at salvation. But as he watched Eleanor pace the halls, her grandmother's love radiating like heat from a fire, he knew he'd made the right choice. Some things mattered more than survival. Some people were worth dying for. The surgery took 4 hours. When Dr. Wells finally emerged, still in her scrubs, her news was cautiously optimistic. Emma would recover, but it had been close, closer than anyone wanted to admit. As Marcus held Eleanor while she cried with relief, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of knowing he'd done something that mattered, something that made him more than just a victim of circumstance and medical neglect. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet discovery of a manila envelope hidden beneath Eleanor's mattress, found by accident when Marcus was helping her gather clothes for Emma's extended hospital stay. The envelope contained medical records, yellowed photographs, and a suicide note written in handwriting so similar to his own that it made his hands tremble as he read the desperate words of a young man who had given up hope 15 years earlier. Daniel Richardson's medical file painted a story that was horrifyingly familiar. The same dismissive doctors, the same misdiagnoses, the same gradual social isolation that had consumed Marcus's own life. But there were differences too, crucial details that Eleanor had never mentioned. Daniel's growth had been located on his neck, making it impossible to hide, and the photograph showed a young man whose condition had progressed far beyond anything Marcus had experienced. The final medical note, dated just 3 days before Daniel's death, contained a revelation that stopped Marcus's heart. Patient presents with signs of necrotizing fasciitis. Recommend immediate surgical intervention. Necrotizing fasciitis, the flesh-eating bacteria that Marcus had heard about in medical documentaries, the kind of infection that could kill within hours if left untreated. Daniel hadn't died by his own hand because he was vain or couldn't handle social rejection. He had been literally dying, consumed by an infection that the medical system had ignored until it was too late to save him. When Eleanor returned from the hospital that evening, she found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel's file spread before him like evidence in a court case. Her face went white as she saw what he had discovered, and for a moment the strong woman who had nursed 3 generations of Cleveland families looked fragile enough to shatter. "I was going to tell you," she whispered, sinking into the chair across from him. "But I was afraid you'd give up if you knew how bad it could get." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, a painful excavation of secrets that Eleanor had buried for 15 years. She told him about Daniel's final weeks, about the smell that had become so overwhelming that neighbors complained to the city, about the red streaks that had spread across his chest like poisoned rivers. She told him about the doctors who had refused to see him, about the emergency room visits that ended with prescriptions for pain medication and advice to keep the area clean. "He called me the night before," Eleanor said, her voice breaking as she relived the memory. "He was delirious with fever, talking about bugs crawling under his skin. I should have driven over there, should have broken down his door, but I thought he was just having a bad night." The next morning his landlord found him. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held 15 years of regret. The medical examiner said the infection had spread to his bloodstream. He probably would have died within hours even if he had waited for help. The weight of this revelation settled over Marcus like a heavy shroud. His own condition, which had seemed like a slow torture, was actually a race against time. The red streaks that had begun to appear around his growth weren't just cosmetic concerns. They were warning signs of the same infection that had killed Eleanor's son. Every day he delayed treatment was a day closer to Daniel's fate. But the cruelest twist was yet to come. As Eleanor continued her confession, she revealed the financial catastrophe that Daniel's death had created. She had mortgaged her house to pay for his medical treatments, spending nearly $200,000 on specialists and procedures that had accomplished nothing. When he died, she was left not only with grief but with debt that had consumed her savings and forced her to work years beyond retirement age. "I'm broke, Marcus," she said simply. "This house, Emma's school, everything we have is hanging by a thread. When I brought you home, I told myself I was just helping another human being in need. But the truth is, I saw my son in you. I saw a chance to save someone when I couldn't save him. But I can't afford to save you either. I don't have the money for the kind of medical care you need." The financial reality was stark and unforgiving. Dr. Rachel Stevens' clinic in California was willing to examine Marcus pro bono, but the actual surgery, if it was even possible at this stage, would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Insurance companies had already denied coverage twice, classifying his condition as a pre-existing cosmetic issue. The GoFundMe campaign that Eleanor had secretly started had raised $3,000 in 3 weeks, a heartwarming but inadequate response to a $250,000 problem. Marcus felt the familiar weight of despair settling over him, but this time it was compounded by guilt. Eleanor had already sacrificed everything once for a young man with his condition. She had lost her son, her savings, and nearly 2 decades of financial security. Now he was asking her to risk losing her granddaughter's future as well. The moral arithmetic was impossible. How do you weigh one life against another? How do you accept help when accepting it might destroy the person offering it? The next morning brought another devastating blow. Emma's surgery had been successful, but complications had developed overnight. Her appendix had ruptured more extensively than initially believed, requiring a second procedure and extended hospitalization. The medical bills were mounting exponentially, and Eleanor's insurance covered only a fraction of the specialized care that Emma needed. As Marcus sat in the hospital waiting room watching Eleanor pace the halls with the frantic energy of someone fighting multiple battles simultaneously, he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He couldn't be the reason this family fell apart. He couldn't be the weight that finally broke Eleanor's spirit or the burden that cost Emma her future security. That afternoon, while Eleanor was meeting with social workers about Emma's care, Marcus quietly gathered his few possessions and left the hospital. He took nothing that belonged to the Richardson family except for a photograph of Daniel that Eleanor had given him weeks earlier, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his struggle, that someone else had walked this path before him. He left a note on Eleanor's kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had left his final message 15 years earlier. "Eleanor and Emma," he wrote in careful block letters, "you saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with medicine. You reminded me that I'm still human, still worth loving, still capable of making choices that matter. I'm going to California to see Dr. Stevens, not because I think she can fix me, but because I need to try everything before I run out of time. Please don't follow me or try to help me financially. You've already given more than anyone should have to give. Take care of Emma. Make sure she knows that the strange man who lived with you for a few weeks thinks she's braver than any soldier and kinder than any saint. Love always, Marcus." The Greyhound bus to Los Angeles left Cleveland at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March, carrying Marcus west with $247 in his pocket and no plan beyond reaching Dr. Stevens' clinic. As the Ohio landscape gave way to Indiana farmland under the cover of darkness, Marcus pressed his forehead against the cold window and tried to imagine a future beyond the infection that was slowly killing him. Behind him, in a Cleveland hospital room, Eleanor Richardson would wake from a brief nap in the uncomfortable visitor's chair to find his note waiting on the bedside table. She would read it 3 times before the tears came, understanding both his reasoning and the impossible choice he had made. In her heart, she would know that he was right, that love sometimes means letting go, that salvation sometimes requires sacrifice. But Marcus didn't know about the phone calls Eleanor would make that night, or the favors she would call in from 40 years of nursing connections. He didn't know about the anonymous donation that would appear in his GoFundMe account the next morning, or the team of specialists who would be waiting for him in Los Angeles. He only knew that he was finally moving toward something instead of running from it, carrying the love of a family that had claimed him as their own even when he couldn't afford to stay. The phone call came while Marcus was standing in the lobby of Dr. Rachel Stevens' clinic, his hands trembling as he filled out intake forms with Eleanor's address as his emergency contact. The receptionist, a kind woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, handed him the phone with an expression of barely contained excitement. "There's someone who needs to speak with you," she said softly. "It's about your surgery." Eleanor's voice crackled through the phone line, made thin by distance but strengthened by determination that had been building for 15 years. "Marcus Thompson, don't you dare hang up on me," she said before he could speak. "I've been making phone calls all night, and you've got people in your corner that you don't even know about. Dr. Stevens has agreed to perform your surgery free of charge, and I found a way to cover the hospital costs." Marcus felt his knees weaken, and he had to lean against the reception desk for support. "Eleanor, I can't let you spend any more money on me. Emma's fine," Eleanor interrupted, her nurse's voice brooking no argument. "Her insurance approved the extended care, and she's responding beautifully to treatment. More importantly, she made me promise to bring you home. That little girl has been crying every night since you left, asking when Uncle Marcus is coming back." Uncle Marcus? The title hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of belonging that he'd almost forgotten was possible. Through the clinic's floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the Los Angeles skyline shimmering in the morning heat, a city of strangers that had somehow become the setting for a miracle he'd never dared to hope for. Dr. Rachel Stevens emerged from her office at that moment, her professional calm radiating the same confidence that had made her YouTube channel famous among people dealing with unusual skin conditions. She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing as they conducted their initial assessment of his condition. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending a hand that was warm and steady, "I've been following your story since Eleanor contacted my office yesterday. I've reviewed the photographs she sent, and I believe we can help you. But I need you to understand that this isn't going to be a simple procedure. What you have is far more complex than anything you've been told before." The examination that followed was the most thorough Marcus had ever experienced. Dr. Stevens photographed his condition from every angle, took measurements, and asked detailed questions about symptoms that previous doctors had dismissed as unimportant. She examined the drainage patterns, tested the odor, and traced the red streaks that had been spreading across his back with the focused intensity of a detective studying evidence. "This isn't a cyst, a lipoma, or any of the other diagnoses you've been given," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This is a complex pilonidal sinus that has developed into a chronic infection with necrotizing components. The reason it keeps coming back is that previous procedures only drain the surface fluid without addressing the underlying sinus tracts that connect deep into your tissue." She pulled up a diagram on her computer screen, showing him the intricate network of infected tunnels that had been growing beneath his skin for 11 years. "Think of it like an iceberg," she explained. "What you see on the surface is only a small fraction of what's actually there. Every time someone drained the visible portion, they left behind the root system that would inevitably regenerate and spread." The surgical plan she outlined was both terrifying and hopeful. They would need to remove not just the visible mass, but several inches of surrounding tissue, following the sinus tracts down to healthy tissue and then reconstructing the area with skin grafts. The procedure would take 8 to 10 hours and require a team of specialists, including plastic surgeons and infectious disease experts. "The good news," Dr. Stevens continued, "is that this is completely curable if we do it right. The bad news is that it's going to be a long recovery, and there are significant risks. The infection has been in your system for over a decade. Your body has been fighting a war that it's been slowly losing, and that kind of chronic inflammation can affect everything from your immune system to your heart." Marcus nodded, absorbing information that finally made sense of the fatigue, the intermittent fevers, and the general sense of unwellness that had become his normal. For the first time in years, someone was explaining his experience rather than dismissing it, treating him like a complex medical case rather than a simple cosmetic concern. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Marcus a weekend to prepare both physically and emotionally for what Dr. Stevens warned would be the most difficult week of your life, followed by the beginning of your actual life. She prescribed a course of powerful antibiotics to begin fighting the infection before surgery, and arranged for him to stay in a nearby medical hotel where he could be monitored for any changes in his condition. That weekend, Marcus walked the streets of Los Angeles with a strange sense of borrowed time. Everything felt heightened. The warmth of the California sun on his face, the casual friendliness of strangers, the simple pleasure of sitting in a coffee shop without worrying about the smell that had marked him as different for so many years. He called Eleanor every night, reporting on his progress and listening to updates about Emma's recovery. "She's drawing pictures for your hospital room," Eleanor told him on Sunday night. "Mostly butterflies and flowers, but she's working on one that shows you playing baseball again. She's convinced that once you're better, you're going to teach her how to pitch." The morning of surgery arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that marks life's pivotal moments. Marcus lay on the pre-op gurney, wearing a hospital gown that eliminated the last pretense of hiding his condition, surrounded by a medical team that saw him not as a monster or curiosity, but as a puzzle they were determined to solve. Dr. Stevens stopped by before they wheeled him into the operating room, her presence bringing a calm that he hadn't expected. "I want you to know," she said, taking his hand in both of hers, "that I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone fight as hard as you have to stay alive. Your body should have given up years ago, but something inside you refused to quit. That strength is going to carry you through today and every day after." As the anesthesia took hold, Marcus's last conscious thought was of Emma's laugh, of Eleanor's fierce protectiveness, and of the possibility that he might actually live to justify their faith in him. The darkness that claimed him was different from the despair he'd carried for so long. This was the darkness of healing, of necessary destruction that would make room for something better. The surgery lasted 11 hours. Marcus would later learn that the infection had spread even further than Dr. Stevens had initially suspected, requiring the removal of tissue that extended nearly to his spine. They found necrotic areas that had been poisoning his system for years, sinus tracts that branched like the root system of a diseased tree, and pockets of infection that explained the chronic fatigue and malaise that had been slowly draining his life force. When he woke up in the recovery room, the first thing he noticed was the absence of smell, not just the sour odor that had marked his condition, but the absence of the underlying scent of sickness that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The second thing he noticed was Eleanor, sitting in the chair beside his bed with Emma curled up asleep in her lap, both of them wearing matching t-shirts that read "Team Marcus" in glittery letters. "Welcome back to the land of the living, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her eyes bright with tears of relief. "Dr. Stevens says they got it all. Every last bit of infection. Gone. You're going to be fine." Emma stirred at the sound of voices, her sleepy face brightening into a smile that could have powered the entire hospital. "Uncle Marcus, you're awake. Grandma Eleanor said you were going to be okay, but I was still scared. Are you going to play baseball with me when you get better?" Marcus tried to speak but found his throat too raw from the breathing tube. Instead, he nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks as he realized that for the first time in 11 years, someone was asking him about his future rather than just helping him survive his present. The growth that had defined him for over a third of his life was gone. But more importantly, the isolation and despair that had grown alongside it were gone too. Over the next 2 weeks, as Marcus healed under the watchful care of Eleanor and Emma, he began to understand what Dr. Stevens had meant about the beginning of his actual life. The physical healing was remarkable. The surgical site closing cleanly, the red streaks fading, his energy returning in waves that reminded him of what it felt like to be young and healthy. But the emotional healing was even more profound. Eleanor had flown out to Los Angeles using money from a fundraising campaign that had exploded across social media once Dr. Stevens shared Marcus's story. Thousands of people who had never met him contributed to his care, sharing their own stories of medical dismissal and misdiagnosis, creating a community of support that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined possible. On the day they flew back to Cleveland, Marcus caught his reflection in the airport bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the man looking back at him. Not because he looked different, though the absence of the hunched posture and defensive body language was striking, but because he looked alive in a way that he had almost forgotten was possible. His shoulders were square, his head held high, and for the first time in years he met his own eyes in the mirror without flinching. The flight home was a celebration disguised as routine travel. Emma chattered excitedly about the plans she'd made for his recovery, including a welcome home party with all the neighbors and a homemade cake that she'd been practicing in Eleanor's kitchen. Eleanor sat quietly beside him, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand in a gesture that had become their shorthand for, "You're going to be okay now." As the plane descended toward Cleveland, Marcus looked out at the familiar landscape of his childhood and felt something he hadn't experienced since that baseball game 11 years ago. Hope for the future. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning, but the quiet confidence of someone who had survived the worst and discovered that there was still beauty in the world, still love to be found, still reasons to keep fighting for tomorrow. The story that had begun with shame and isolation was ending with family and possibility. Proof that sometimes the longest nights do indeed give way to morning. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin in the darkest places. Marcus Thompson's journey from that frozen Cleveland doorway to a warm family table reminds us that hope isn't something we find. It's something we choose to give and receive, even when we have nothing left to offer. Eleanor Richardson, at 67, had already buried her son and weathered decades of heartbreak. Yet she chose to open her door to a stranger who needed more than shelter. He needed someone to believe he was worth saving. Emma, just 11 years old, saw past the surface to the human being beneath, teaching us that love doesn't require perfection, only presence. Their story proves that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about three broken souls who choose to heal together. In a world that often teaches us to look away from suffering, they looked toward it and found redemption. Marcus discovered that surviving isn't the same as living, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is allowing others to love us back to wholeness. True healing happens not in sterile medical facilities, but around kitchen tables where we're seen, accepted, and reminded that tomorrow can be different from today. What moment in your own life taught you that family can be found in unexpected places? Have you ever been the Eleanor or Emma for someone who needed hope? Or were you the Marcus who needed saving?